My name is Elizabeth, and I just turned 17 when my life changed dramatically, turning everything familiar upside down, leaving me in a state of confusion in which there seemed to be no corner where I could hide from this whirlwind storm. Let me paint you a picture of my family, in which, at first glance, everything looked as if we had the most ordinary life, the one that can be found in countless suburban houses hidden behind white fences and neat lawns. My father worked tirelessly, running a store that was part of a company once founded by my maternal grandmother, an ambitious and indomitable woman who turned a small chain of household appliance stores into a successful detergent business. When my grandmother decided to retire, she offered the management of the business to my mother, but she showed no interest, so my father took over the reins, and from that moment on, as if on an unknown signal, something inexplicable began to happen in our family, something that, as it seemed to me, it was just a vague premonition of an impending hurricane. I remember how everything went to hell that day, destroying the delicate balance I was almost used to. I was sitting in my room, bent over my textbook, trying to concentrate on my homework, when from downstairs, from the first floor, I heard my mother's sharp, piercing scream, sounding as if anger, pain, and something else were intertwined in her voice, which I could not identify. "You're just a loser, John. This is my home, my family's business. You should be grateful." Her voice trembled, but not from tears, but rather from rage, which every day more and more captured her, turning her into a woman whom I hardly recognized as my mother. In the following weeks, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly tense. My parents stopped talking to each other, and even 5-year-old Amy, my younger sister, couldn't help but notice that something terrible was happening to us, something that could hardly be fixed. I tried to distract her, telling her bedtime stories, taking her for a walk in the park, but in her eyes, filled with an adult understanding that was not childish, I read what I was most afraid of. She also realized that our family was about to burst at the seams. And then came the day that turned everything around completely, leaving a feeling of emptiness in my soul, comparable perhaps only to the feeling when you stand on the edge of a precipice and know that a fall is inevitable. I came home from school, dropped my backpack at the entrance, took off my jacket, and was about to go into the kitchen when I saw my father in the living room, standing next to a large, dark suitcase that looked alien here, as if it belonged not to him, but to someone else. "Dad," my voice trembled, my breathing became heavy, because I already knew, felt with every cell of my body, that something terrible was about to happen. He turned around, pain flashing in his eyes, which made me clench my fingers into a fist, as if I could escape from it. He came up to me, hugged me tightly, too tightly, as if he was trying to convey in this embrace everything that he had not had time to say in recent days. "I'm sorry, honey," his voice was hoarse, full of restrained emotions. "I can't stay here anymore, it's not good for anyone." I wanted to say something, to protest, to make him change his mind, but the words stuck in my throat, and the only thing I could manage was, "But what about Amy? What about me?" He averted his eyes, his shoulders shook, and then he exhaled like a man who had lost the most important battle of his life. "I love you both, never forget that, but sometimes love is not enough." He kissed me on the forehead, then went up to Amy, who was standing a little to the side, hugged her tightly, whispering, "Be good for your older sister, okay, pumpkin," and just left. The door closed behind him with a finality that made me want to scream, but I couldn't. I just stood there, feeling something inside me crumble, slowly but irreversibly. When Mom returned home an hour later, I barely had time to look up at her. My voice was barely audible. "Dad's gone." She didn't look surprised. She just nodded, as if she had been expecting this for a long time, as if she had long ago accepted the inevitability that I did not want to admit until the last moment. "Okay," she said, and I froze in disbelief. "How can you say that?" My voice broke, but she just looked at me, tired, hard, as if she had aged 10 years in one day. "Your father cheated on me, Elizabeth. More than once." Her words were as cold as a knife blade that pierced right through me, leaving behind only a blank void in which there were no tears, no anger, not even pain, just an icy, sticky feeling that my whole world was a lie. That night, I was lying in my room, staring at the ceiling, and I could hear my mom talking on the phone in her room. She was laughing. Her laugh was clear, light, and full of the same joy that I hadn't heard in her voice in months. I didn't know who she was talking to, and I didn't want to know, because I didn't even have the energy to be curious. I closed my eyes, hoping that sleep would bring at least some relief. But in the morning, when I came down to breakfast, it turned out that all this was just the beginning. "I have some news," Mom said, filling her coffee cup without even looking up at me. "I'm getting married." I choked on my cereal, coughing so sharply that Amy looked at me in alarm. "What?" "Mom, but it's only been 2 months." She just waved her hand as if my words had no meaning. "Sometimes true love comes unexpectedly, Elizabeth. You'll understand when you get older." Robert moved in a week later, and although I would like to say that I immediately felt something ominous, in fact, everything was not so obvious, not so clear that you could call it a premonition, but tangible enough that an insistent, subtle irritation settled in me. He was, as they say, an attractive man, tall, with expressive features, and had a charming smile that seemed to inspire confidence, but every time he was around, I had a strange feeling that there was something artificial about him, something carefully calibrated. Gestures. He behaved completely differently with different people. For Amy, he was a caring adult who played with her, helped with lessons, patiently explained things she didn't understand. For Mom, he was a reliable partner with whom she discussed business for hours, making decisions as if they were the perfect team. But with me, he was cold to me, just enough that I couldn't find fault, but enough that I felt invisible, as if my existence in this house didn't matter. Meanwhile, the company was also undergoing changes. After my father left, my mother completely took over the management of the business and, to my considerable surprise, she did not hesitate to make Robert her right-hand man, entrusting him with key processes, as if he had always been a part of the system. They spent more and more time together, developing new strategies, making decisions, and every time I entered the house and heard them discussing business in a low voice, I was gripped by an uneasy feeling that I was becoming an outsider in my own family. I tried not to dwell on it. I tried to focus on school, on friends, on ordinary teenage things, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself that none of this concerned me, it was impossible to ignore the fact that my mother now lived in a completely different world in which there was no place for me. But I didn't even imagine how far things would go until one evening my mother came into my room with an expression on her face that I immediately recognized as a sign of upcoming news, and, sitting on the edge of my bed, said calmly, almost without emotion, "Robert and I have made a decision. We are opening a new branch in another city." I stared at her in silence, waiting for her to continue, feeling something was wrong, but even I wasn't ready for what she would say next. "We're moving," she added, looking away as if she was embarrassed, although I doubted she had any doubts about her words. I didn't immediately realize the meaning of what was said, but when it dawned on me, I slowly exhaled and asked, trying to remain calm, "Good. What about me?" The answer came immediately, as if she had thought this point out a long time ago. "Robert and I talked and decided it would be better if you stayed here." I blinked, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Stay here? Without you?" My voice cracked, and I felt anger rising in my chest. "Well, there won't be much room in the new house," Mom hurriedly explained, clearly wanting to quickly close the subject. "And you're almost out of school. It doesn't make sense to transfer to another city right before the exams." Her words sounded logical, but logic was the last thing I cared about at that moment. "So where should I live?" I almost shouted the question, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Mom sighed heavily, her tone becoming irritated, as if I was throwing a tantrum out of the blue. "Don't be dramatic, Elizabeth. You'll stay with Grandma. She's already agreed to it." These words were the last straw. I jumped to my feet, stormed out of the room, and slammed the door, crawling under the covers, trying to hide from the overwhelming feeling of betrayal. Hot tears were streaming down my face, and the same question was ringing in my head: when did I become a burden to my own mother? The following weeks passed in the chaos of packing and preparing for the move. I did my best not to show my feelings, especially in front of Amy, who, unlike me, was genuinely saddened that she would have to leave her usual life and friends. I helped her put the toys in the boxes, trying not to show my emotions, but every time she looked at me with her huge brown eyes full of tears, I felt something break inside me. "Are you coming to visit us, Lizzie?" she asked one evening, snuggling up to me as if trying to memorize my warmth. I hugged her tightly, running my fingers through her soft blonde hair. "Of course I'll come," I whispered, although I wasn't sure about those words myself. "You can't get rid of me that easily." The day they left, I stood on the porch next to my grandmother, watching the van with their belongings disappear over the horizon. Mom gave me a quick hug goodbye, Robert just nodded briefly, and Amy waved at me out the window for a long time until her face was completely out of sight. At that moment, I realized that now I have to rebuild my life, but without them. Living with my grandmother wasn't as bad as I expected. She was surprisingly tactful, didn't ask questions, gave me the space I needed, but she was always there for me, ready to listen when I wanted to talk. She made me tea, told me stories about how she went through hard times when she was young, and I even began to believe that all this would one day remain just a part of my past. But no matter how stable my new lifestyle seemed, time moved inexorably forward, and one day I woke up with the realization that it was my 18th birthday. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, expecting to be overcome by joy, anticipation of something new, but instead I felt only emptiness. The phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I answered, holding the phone to my ear, and heard her voice, bright, cheerful, almost too animated. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said, and I caught myself thinking that there wasn't the slightest note of regret in her voice. "I'm sorry we can't be there." Mom's voice sounded light, even casual, as if it was just a minor inconvenient moment in her busy schedule. "We have a lot of work to do. We have a very busy period right now, but we will definitely celebrate when we arrive next month, okay?" I knew they wouldn't come. They haven't come back since they left, and nothing will change this time. They always found excuses, like work, important meetings, or Amy not feeling well. I stopped believing in it a long time ago, but every time I still felt pain, as if I was bumping into fragments of my own trust again. "Of course, Mom, it sounds great," I replied with artificial cheerfulness, not wanting to give her any reason to feel my disappointment. Grandma must have sensed my mood, because on this day she arranged for me a celebration that was not inferior in importance to any family celebration. She let me invite friends over, ordered my favorite food, and even baked a cake herself, even though the bakery on the corner did it just as well. For a few hours, I almost forgot about everything else, allowing myself to just enjoy the moment, laugh, chat with friends and feel not abandoned, but needed. The next morning, Grandma called me into her office. Her expression was so serious that my stomach clenched uncomfortably. I immediately realized that this was not going to be an easy conversation. "Sit down, Elizabeth," she said, pointing to a chair in front of her massive desk, where she probably made a lot of important decisions. I obeyed, feeling anxiety rising inside. Oh my God, is she kicking me out? But before the panic could overwhelm me completely, Grandma smiled, reached into her desk drawer and took out a small folder, placing it in front of me. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said, nodding at the folder, making it clear that I should open it. I did so, and almost dropped it when I realized what I was looking at. "Grandmother. This." She nodded, her eyes carefully watching my reaction. "It's your company now, Elizabeth." I blinked, feeling a single thought throbbing in my head. I had just turned 18 and suddenly became the owner of a multimillion-dollar business. It was like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. I do not know what to say," I stammered, stunned. Grandma reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and looked warmly into my eyes. You don't have to say anything, just promise me that you'll give her everything you can. I nodded, still in a daze. I promise. Grandma leaned back, pleased, and folded her hands on the table. Good. Now I have one more piece of advice for you, and I want you to listen to me carefully. I leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Call your dad. There's more to this story than you think. Talk to him. Take him on as a consultant if you want, but listen to him. It took me a whole week to work up the courage to follow her advice. Eventually, I dialed his number and we agreed to meet at a small cafe in the city center. When I saw him, my heart sank. He looked older, tired, and had new wrinkles in his face, but when he noticed me, his eyes lit up with the warmth I remembered from childhood. We sat down opposite each other, and an awkward silence hung between us, but soon everything suddenly spilled out: the divorce, Mom's remarriage, the move, and Grandma's gift. I told him everything, without holding back, pouring out all my emotions, all the pain and resentment. He listened in silence, his face reflecting a mix of emotions that I couldn't quite read. When I finished, he took a deep breath, ran his hand over his face, and looked at me with some heaviness in his eyes. Lizzie, there's something you need to know about divorce, he said, and his voice sounded hoarse, as if he'd been holding it in for a long time. Then he told me everything. How his mother never respected him, how she constantly nagged, humiliated, said that he was a loser, that he would not achieve anything without her family. How she demanded that he live by her rules, do what she thought was right. Like after one particularly serious argument, when she called him a jerk again, he got drunk and made the biggest mistake of his life. I cheated on her, he confessed, lowering his head, and immediately regretted it. But your mother, she used it against me. I stared at him in silence, feeling my insides turn over. She threatened to sue, demanded that I leave her everything, children, house, business. She said that if I tried to fight, she would make sure that I would never see you again. He paused, ran his hand over his face again, as if trying to erase the traces of memories from it. I did the only thing I could, he gasped. I left her everything she wanted. I sat there, stunned. It wasn't like the mother I knew, or at least thought I knew. Why didn't you fight? I asked, and there was more emotion in my voice than I expected. Her voice was filled with gentle concern, but I knew my mother too well not to hear the note of calculated falsehood hidden behind this artificial softness, this unexpected affection that had never been there before. She looked at me with a smile, her eyes slightly moistened, as if she really missed me, as if she cared. We could make up for lost time, she continued, taking a step toward me, and I barely managed not to step back. Amy misses you so much. Robert and I are too. I know it's been difficult, but we're a family, honey, and a family should stick together. I blinked slowly, gathering my thoughts, until her words echoed in my head. Did she miss me? Is she the one who never found the time to come, who didn't call when I graduated from high school, who even now hasn't asked where I've enrolled? I looked at Robert, who was standing next to my mom with his arms crossed over his chest, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't look happy or warm, but rather annoyed, like a man who had been forced into a conversation he didn't want to take part in. You want me to move in with you, I said slowly, feeling a strange feeling rise up inside, a mixture of bitterness and indignation. Why now? What do you mean? Mom tilted her head to the side, pretending she didn't understand. You haven't come to see me in years. I clenched my fingers into a fist, but I tried to keep my voice steady. You weren't interested in how I live, what's going on with me. And now all of a sudden you're here, saying you miss me, and surely this has nothing to do with the fact that the company now belongs to me? Mom's face twitched, but she quickly pulled herself together, pulling a friendly mask over her face. Elizabeth, honey, how can you think that? Her voice was still gentle, but I noticed how her fingers tightened, gripping the strap of her bag. It's very simple. I looked her straight in the eye, then looked at Robert. You're not here because of me. You're here for the money. There was silence, thick, intense, almost palpable. This is absurd, Robert finally spoke up, his voice hard and irritated, as if my accusation had offended him personally. We just want everything to be right. The company was founded by your grandmother. Your mother ran it for so many years, and now you've just blocked our access to finance, as if we were strangers. Because it's my company now, I said firmly, and with every word I uttered, I felt my confidence grow. And I'm not going to let you take advantage of her. Mom opened her mouth, but then Grandma intervened, who had been silent until then, carefully watching what was happening. Have you said everything you want to say, Helen? Her voice was calm, but there was an unwavering firmness in it. Mom, don't start. Mom rolled her eyes, and at that moment all the pretended warmth disappeared from her face. Then go away, Grandma pointed at the door. Mom's eyes flashed, her lips tightened into a thin line, and then, abruptly turning on her heels, she left the house, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume. Robert paused for a moment, looked at me with an expression that I couldn't quite decipher, but said nothing, just nodded briefly and followed her. The door closed, leaving me standing in the middle of the room, still feeling the remnants of tension hanging in the air. I'm proud of you, Grandma said after a short pause, putting her hand on my shoulder. I exhaled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized until that moment. Thank you, I said softly, knowing that my life had changed completely from that day on. I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, which did not want to dissipate in any way, despite the sun's rays breaking through the curtains, filling the room with soft morning light. Last night was still in front of my eyes, harsh words, outbursts of anger, the searing truth that could not be ignored. I rolled over onto my back, staring at the ceiling, and realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The last of my illusions about my mother crumbled to dust, and even though I thought I'd been ready for this for a long time, there was still some painful emptiness inside, as if something I hadn't even realized was valuable had been taken away from me. I pulled the covers up to my chin, closed my eyes, but there was no sleep, just lingering thoughts about how much my life had changed this year. I started this journey as an ordinary 17-year-old girl, but now I had a responsibility that I had never even dreamed of, and the realization that I would have to deal with it on my own seemed both frightening and exciting. I took a deep breath, forced myself to sit up, ran my hand through my disheveled hair, and finally got out of bed, even though every cell in my body wanted to stay safe in the soft sheets. The house was quiet, only the smell of freshly brewed tea wafted from the kitchen, mixing with the light aromas of baking. I slowly went downstairs, straightening my t-shirt as I went, and saw my grandmother sitting at the table with a newspaper in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. Good morning, honey, she looked up, studying my face intently. How are you feeling? I shrugged, sinking into the chair across from her. Honestly, I don't know. Grandma put down the newspaper, folded her hands on the table and looked at me with warmth, in which there was not a drop of pity, only sincere understanding. It's okay, she said, leaning forward. After such conversations, there is always a residue. But trust me, it will get easier over time. I nodded, but a storm of emotions was still raging inside. I wanted to ask if it would really get easier, but instead I took a piece of warm croissant from the plate and silently took a bite, giving myself a little time to collect my thoughts. Yesterday you said that we would start planning for my future. I finally spoke up, trying to focus on something constructive. Grandma's eyes flashed with approval, and she nodded. Yes, it is. You have a company, but that doesn't mean you have to rush into business right away. You have to study, gain experience, figure out what you really want before making serious decisions. So you don't want me to take over right away? She smiled, shaking her head. You're a smart girl, Elizabeth, but you need time to figure out how things work. While you are studying, I will help you, and your father, if you decide, can also become a part of this process. The main thing is to take your time and not let anyone, especially your mother, dictate to you what to do. I thought about it. Yesterday, when my mother stood in front of me, when her voice was full of anger and disappointment, I realized that I was no longer afraid of her. I was not afraid of being rejected by her. I no longer sought her approval. It was a liberating feeling, and it was probably what allowed me to think about the future now without looking back. Okay, I said, meeting Grandma's eyes. Then where do we start? She laughed, pushing a notebook and pen towards me. Let's start by making a plan. You have a whole summer ahead of you before college, and you can use it wisely. I picked up the pen, feeling strangely excited. It was a new beginning. A beginning that belonged only to me. Mom was sitting across from us, her fingers clutching the strap of her bag like a lifeline, her eyes darting from face to face, but there wasn't a drop of doubt or a bit of anxiety in them, just annoyance and stubbornness bordering on blindness. She shook her head, as if dismissing the ridiculous, in her opinion, absurdity that we had just presented to her. This is ridiculous, she repeated, and there was a nervous note in her voice. Robert loves me, he would never do that. I looked at my grandmother, then at my father. They were silent, giving her the opportunity to realize everything on her own, but she wasn't going to realize. Mom looked like every piece of evidence we provided, hotel receipts, transfer records, documents pointing to his past scams, was just a bunch of meaningless papers unrelated to the reality in which she lived. Mom, I finally said, my voice strained but steady, don't you even want to look at the evidence? She gave me a quick, displeased look, then turned it back to Grandma, her lips pressed into a thin line. It's some kind of mistake, she replied sharply. How could you believe that? Who is this so-called detective? Where is the guarantee that he is not lying? Oh, Helen, Grandma sighed heavily, shaking her head. Do you really think I would accuse Robert without checking the information thoroughly? This man has already pulled off a similar scheme 3 times. One of his former victims is a widow who lost all her savings. And you want to say that he's suddenly changed, that for your sake he decided to become an honest man? He's not like that. Mom jumped up, her face flushed with anger. You're all just jealous, you can't stand that I'm happy. I couldn't stand it and laughed, bitterly, nervously, joylessly. Happy? I asked again. Are you really happy, Mom? Or do you just like to pretend that your world isn't falling apart? She looked at me with the same expression she used to look at her father when she despised him for not being successful enough, not strong enough, not good enough for her. You've always been so stubborn, she hissed. Just like him. Thank God, I replied calmly, no longer feeling any fear or pain. Just fatigue. Mom abruptly turned to her father, who hadn't said a word before, just watching what was happening, but there was something in his eyes that seemed to strike a chord with her. Are you standing here and not saying anything? What is it? She accused him. You like to see me make mistakes, don't you? You're probably enjoying this. The father slowly stood up, crossed his arms over his chest and calmly replied. No, Helen. I don't like seeing you make mistakes. But I realized a long time ago that it's useless to argue with you. I just hope that someday you'll open your eyes before it's too late. For a moment, it seemed to me that her face trembled, that she was about to stagger under the weight of what she said, but she quickly gathered herself, hiding behind the wall of arrogant indifference again. I have nothing to do here, she said dryly, picking up her bag. You all just want to ruin my life. She turned abruptly and headed for the door, but paused with her hand on the handle. When Robert proves you all wrong, I don't want to hear any apologies from you, she said over her shoulder. Grandma didn't say a word, and neither did Dad. I just nodded. Of course, Mom. She opened the door and went out, slamming it so that the frame shook. There was a tense silence in the room for a while. Then Grandma slowly got to her feet and sighed heavily. "Well," she said calmly, "let's see how long it takes her to figure out the truth." I sat back down on the couch, holding my head in my hands. "Do you think she'll ever understand?" Grandma shrugged her shoulders. "People only see what they want to see, Elizabeth. But when reality hits her in the face, she won't have a choice." My father sat down next to me, patting me on the shoulder. "The main thing is that you and I know the truth," he said. "And we know who really cares about us." I looked at him, then at Grandma, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. I sat in my room, holding the phone in my hand, and was silent for a long time, thinking about my father's words. Somewhere deep inside me, there was still a tiny spark of hope that Mom would eventually realize her mistakes, realize what she had done, and try to change, not for the sake of gain, not in order to regain control of our lives, but for real, sincerely, out of a desire to be with us. But I knew her too well, her pride, her stubbornness, her unwillingness to admit that she had ever been wrong. "She is. What did she look like?" I finally asked, trying not to let my voice betray the storm of emotions raging inside me. "Exhausted," my father replied after a short pause. "Tired. It's like the last few months have drained her more than she's willing to admit." I closed my eyes, pressing the phone to my ear. "And you really told her no?" "Yes, Lizzie." Dad's voice was firm, but there was no anger in it, just fatigue and something like regret. "I'm not going to let her play with our lives anymore. I can't go through this again. And I'm not going to let Amy go through with it." I took a deep breath, opening my eyes and looking out the window, where the autumn leaves were slowly falling, carried by the light evening breeze. "Do you think she'll ever understand?" "Maybe," he replied, and there was the same doubt in his voice as there was in mine. "But not now." After that conversation, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The memories came in waves: childhood, when Mom still seemed caring and loving, the moments when the whole family laughed, when Dad picked me up in his arms, when Amy was just born, and Mom hugged her for the first time, looking at her with such warmth that she hadn't looked at any of us for a long time. Was there a chance to get back at least a piece of the woman she once was? Or was she forever consumed by a thirst for control, a desire for power and a life in which she did not admit her mistakes? But when I woke up the next morning, I realized that no matter how much I wanted an answer, it no longer mattered. Because I knew that no matter what he was, I wasn't going to wait for my mom to change anymore. I wasn't going to build my life expecting that one day she would come back to us with sincere remorse. I've already made my choice. I immersed myself in my studies and work, fully focusing on the future. The company required attention, and under my grandmother's guidance, I gradually mastered its subtleties, learned how to make decisions, analyze the market, and understand finances. Sometimes it was exhausting, sometimes it felt like I was drowning under the weight of responsibility, but with it came another feeling: confidence. I was no longer the lost girl I once thought I was. I knew what I wanted. Amy lived with her dad, and it was the best thing that could happen to her. She blossomed, became more cheerful, self-confident. We saw each other every week, called each other every day, and I didn't have to worry that she was feeling lonely or unhappy. Dad took care of her in a way that Mom never seemed to be able to. And Mom, she disappeared from our lives as quickly as she tried to return to it. After my father's refusal, she texted me several times, alternating between reproaches and attempts to establish contact, but I did not respond. Then she stopped. I heard that she sold her house, that she lived in another city for a while, and that she was trying to make a life for herself, but in the end, even the news about her stopped bothering me. As time passed, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from her approval. Free from her manipulations. Free to build my life the way I want. I exhaled, letting a warm feeling spread inside, feeling as the remnants of the tension that had been accumulating for months finally began to leave me, leaving behind not emptiness, but lightness, as if I had dropped a heavy load that I had been carrying for so long that I almost stopped noticing its weight. I didn't know I was holding up so well, I said, surprised at the force of my own voice. You deserve better, Dad. We all deserve it. There was a pause on the other end of the line, but I could hear him exhaling slowly, as if savoring every word I said, as if they were confirmation that he had really done the right thing, that his decision had finally given him the freedom he had been striving for so long. When did you become so wise, Lizzie? What is it? He finally asked, and there was a smile in his voice. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. I've studied with the best. When the conversation ended and I put my phone on the bedside table, I looked around my room, where I had spent so many days processing memories, piecing together my life after it had once shattered into pieces. There were textbooks in neat piles on the table, and next to them were the company reports that I had been looking through in the evenings. Photos smiled at me from the bulletin board, me, Amy, and Dad laughing during a picnic last summer, a picture of the whole family at Grandma's table, and a small note with her sprawling handwriting. I always knew you had it in you. It wasn't the life I imagined a year ago. She wasn't perfect. There were still so many challenges ahead, so many decisions I had to make, so many lessons to learn, but she was real. She was mine. I thought about my mother, a woman who was so eager to control everything and everyone that in the end she was left alone, cornered by her own intrigues and manipulations. I felt a tiny pang of pity, but it quickly dissipated, giving way to a stronger feeling, the realization of justice. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with its consequences. And I had a family that loved me, a company that needed to be managed, and a future full of possibilities. Time flew by as I combined college studies and participation in the management of a multimillion-dollar company. Before I knew it, I was halfway to my degree, buried in textbooks, financial reports, and business strategies. Weekdays were spent in endless lectures, night classes filled with notes and schedules, but I cherished weekends as a sacred time that was only mine. Every Friday night, I packed my bag and went home to where they were waiting for me. Lizzie. Amy screamed, running into the hallway and throwing her arms around my neck, her thin arms hugging me with a force that made me laugh. At 10 years old, she was all long, clumsy limbs and endless energy. Her brown eyes shone with joy every time I crossed the threshold. Dad would come out of the kitchen, usually in an apron, with a raised eyebrow and a grin, already knowing that our traditional family dinner was waiting for him. You're just in time, he said, setting the table. This weekend has become my anchor. We ate together, listening to Amy chatter about school and her new friends. Dad and I discussed the company, and when Amy went to bed, we often stayed up late into the night, studying business processes, analyzing markets, making forecasts. On Sundays we went to visit my grandmother. She greeted us at the door with an unfailing smile and the table always set. You all look hungry, she said, handing us plates, and the house filled with the smells of fried chicken and freshly baked apple pie. After lunch, we went out on the porch, enjoying the last rays of the sun, talking about everything and nothing, and in those moments I realized that I had found my world, my place, my life. I always knew you had it in you, Elizabeth, Grandma said, squeezing my hand. Graduation was approaching. Excitement and slight fear overwhelmed me, but I knew that I had support. Dad kept his word. He managed the company skillfully, passing on knowledge to me, and was ready to let me take the reins of government into his own hands at any moment. I'm ready to hand over power when you're ready, he said one evening, sitting across from me with a cup of coffee. I hugged him tightly, feeling my throat constrict with emotion. Thanks, Dad. For everything. Life wasn't perfect. There were challenges ahead, new solutions, and even more responsibility. But when I looked at my family, Dad, Amy, Grandma, I knew we could handle it. We can handle anything. Together.